In the recent week between Christmas and New Year's, I found that I had a little more time on my hands. And in that time, I rediscovered my love for solo D&D. Solo D&D, you may ask? Isn't D&D designed to be a cooperative game with other people? Yeah, you're right. But as usual with TTRPGs, there are many different ways to play the same game. In fact, solo D&D offers its own unique benefits and insights that can make you a more well-rounded dungeon master, player, and it's just a plain fun experience. Hi, I'm John from Incendium D&D, and today we're going to be talking about the unique benefits and fun you can have playing solo D&D. Let's get into it. Alright, just like our other videos, it's time for our influence action roll-off. I'm going to try to influence you to become a subscriber through a persuasion check, and let's see if your roll is better than mine. Alright, here we go! Alright, if you got below an 18 for today, welcome to the channel. So what exactly am I talking about when I say solo D&D? Solo D&D is exactly what it sounds like. It means you're running a game where you're both the dungeon master and player character or party of player characters. Sounds kinda lonely, am I right?
Oh, boo-hoo! Let me play a sad song for you on the world's smallest violin.
This is serious.
I know. This really is the world's smallest violin. See?
Again, though, the amount of fun you can have has everything to do with your approach. Now, as you can imagine, this probably wouldn't be a lot of fun if I was like just the DM narrating to myself out loud and then also pretending to be a player improvising and like reacting in real time. So for solo D&D, I actually do a written thing where I open up a Google Doc. When an adventure presents boxed text descriptions, I just write that box text into my little Google Doc. And then I write out the dialogue, actions, and descriptions of the player characters and the non-player characters. And just like regular D&D, when the game procedures call for it, I roll dice. And that determines how situations resolve and lead the story forward. And besides the fact that this is written and not really done in like a real-time improv setup like normal D&D, it plays like a normal game. Really, you're setting up an environment where you're running the game's procedures as normal, except you're making decisions for both the NPCs, the monsters, and the player characters. Some would also call this writing a book. More on that later. Now, I think the key thing here is that there are a few ways of generating the content that your main character or player character is moving through. I've received some testimonials of other solo D&D players using oracles or other tools to randomly generate events for their characters. It may surprise you, this is not my preferred method. Personally, I found I really like using one of D&D's like many published adventures as the basis of the story I'm going to play through, using a particular adventure as kind of like a writing prompt, and I've tried a few different things that I really enjoy. Like using the adventure's recommendations. So for example, at the beginning of Curse of Strahd, the adventure assumes you have like 4 to 6 player characters of 3rd level. But I've also played adventures like Lost Mine of Phandelver, where it's a single player character started at a higher level, in that case level 5. In the case of Lost Mine, that player character, Solomon, had no backup, no reinforcements, it was just him and just his action economy. And that module gets a lot deadlier when you take away other player characters. To me, an insight I had playing that adventure like that was just the value of action economy. It's much easier to run through that adventure with 4 first level characters than 1 5th level character. So like I said earlier, solo D&D has unique benefits that are impossible or very difficult to find in a group setting. When I first tried out a solo D&D game with Lost Mine of Phandelver, the first thing I noticed is that I was free from having to negotiate the story's tone with the other players at the table. As a DM, and as a responsible and mindful player, When I sit down with a group of other players, I'm usually very conscientious and aware of the comfort and enjoyment of the other players at the table. And I'm not even really talking about lines or veils, which is definitely a relevant part of this conversation. What I mean is that there have been times I've wanted to run or play in a D&D session. Maybe the DM is a little more interested in telling a serious or grounded story, but other players stubbornly want to implement silly or shenanigan-like solutions. Or the opposite, most of the players want to just have a really easy, chill time, but there's that like one player that gets like a little too into it, and they get really dramatic or dive really deep into the emotional core of their character when everyone just wants some beer and pretzels kill the goblins D&D. While I'm not discounting the value of cooperative play, there is something super freeing about getting to play through an adventure module without having to negotiate the moment-by-moment tone that you're going for. This also just happens to be a benefit of writing the game out as opposed to acting it out. But even then, I find with a lot of, say, like text-based games, that there are times I have to negotiate the tone of a particular scene because it's really, really difficult to get all of the player characters in the same mindset and heart set. And because of that, for me in particular, I've found I've had a lot of cool, very emotionally powerful stories come out of very generic adventure modules. Again, let's take a look at Lost Mine, for example. I've played that adventure from beginning to end about 4 or 5 times now. And as you'd expect, every time I run it through a different group of player characters, the story has variances and little things that are different. Most of the time, though, there's at least a few moments that feel a little silly, and there's some kind of thematic negotiation going on between me as the DM with the various player characters. When I ran my own solo game, though, through Lost Mine with Solomon, the story really became this internal struggle between the morality of good and evil. During the first part of the adventure, the Goblin ambush and the Kragmaw hideout, Solomon, even with a limited action economy, went out of his way to spare as many of his goblin assailants as he could, seeing as they were a sentient, sapient folk just like him. But there were times where he would get surrounded and would have to cast like a Thunderwave spell, which would lead to a lot of the goblins dying. And because of the solo nature of the game and the fact I was writing everything down, it gave me the space to really examine that from Solomon's perspective. As I would definitely advise for a cooperative game, when you're a DM and you have player characters, the players and their player characters are the main characters of the story. They're who you should be spending most of the spotlight time on, and other elements like the world and NPCs revolve around their enjoyment and immersion. But when it's just you as a DM, and in this case just me as one PC, it really left the space to start to examine and flesh out a lot of the non-player characters. For example, Solomon ended up becoming really good friends with Gundren Rockseeker. I changed the beginning of the mission from the party of player characters bringing a wagon full of supplies, to it being more of an escort mission where Gundren is himself traveling, and Solomon is like his bodyguard. The little dialogue I got to have between my player character and the adventure's NPC really got me into the headspace of Gundren in a different way, and he became kind of like a main character in the story, where normally there wouldn't be the space for that because the main characters are the party. Sildar Hallwinter is another great example. The first few times I ran Lost Mine, through a traditional party composition, Sildar always came off as this generic quest-giving NPC that the players were really more annoyed with than interested in, which I don't blame them for. In terms of the material that's provided in the module, how he's meant to be used in the adventure, that's kind of the tone that I get. But of course, again, because I had the space, Sildar, I discovered just through my own imagination, was an aging knight who was lamenting how spell-casting peers got more powerful with age. But as a physical fighter, his body was preventing him from doing the things that he wanted to do, like fighting monsters and saving people, like he did when he was a youngster. Because of the little circumstances of the game I played, and because Solomon lacked a formal party, Sildar accompanied him into the Red Brand hideout. After Sildar and Solomon defeated the Nothic in the Red Brand hideout basement, based on Solomon's build, the +1 longsword you get as treasure wasn't going to be really useful, so Solomon gave that +1 weapon to Sildar. Where normally, of course, that would just be other generic loot for player characters. But in this case, it started to cement a unique fraternal relationship between Solomon and Sildar. Then, of course, in the next combat, a bandit hit Sildar with a natural 20. Sildar dropped to 0 because of the action economy limitations of the party comp, and the fact that Solomon was not a healer. 2 other bandits came up, and Sildar died. Now, normally you can imagine if you had a group of 4 player characters, oh no, the annoying NPC died, big whoop. But in this case, Sildar's death still often haunts Solomon, even in subsequent solo D&D adventures that I've run him through. And the NPCs get to do what they're designed to, mean a lot to the player characters. Now, to go back to not having to negotiate a certain tone for my game, let's say this was a player character instead. As we've talked about earlier on this channel, I know Ian kinda hinted to it in one of his most recent videos. Ian's player character Moo got killed in the first round of combat of the latest game I ran. Ian, as a player, asked, can you Deus Ex Machina Moo back to life? And as someone conscientious of my players' enjoyment, I knew that the storytelling integrity of my world is secondary to my players getting to play the characters that they want, and it's not like we had any time to figure out who Ian's character was. This wasn't the right time in the arc of the story for Ian's character to die. So I Deus Ex Machina'd him back to life. We had some BS explanation that he's a Warforged and there was a bit of lightning that rebooted his system. He's back up at 1 hit point. But in the case of the Red Brand hideout, there was nobody's enjoyment besides my own that I had to account for. And while I didn't enjoy the fact that Sildar died, his death was more meaningful because I wanted a more grounded story. To be clear, I don't regret at all the fact that I saved Moo. As a DM and as a human, that was the right call, but in this other instance of solo D&D, that was also the right call to let Sildar go. And that's not to say I haven't BS'd other calls in my solo game. So for example, at the end of Lost Mine, there's supposed to be this climactic battle between Neznar, the drow, and his little army of giant spiders. Well, in that encounter, Solomon got reduced to 0 hit points. Now, this is technically with the rules, in that it says in the giant spider stat block, if the poison is what drops you to 0, the character doesn't die outright, they become stable and paralyzed. But as my own DM, I made the storytelling call that Neznar wouldn't kill Solomon. In fact, there's this whole backstory thing about Solomon having mutagens like The Witcher, and so he wanted to sell his blood to other interested third parties that might be able to take advantage of it somehow. This gets me to another point, which is, as your own DM, not only do you not have to negotiate tone with other players, you don't have to argue about rules calls. I always find it really interesting how a lot of times not only is there a tonal negotiation with the table, but how often there's kind of a rules dispute or a conflict of storytelling ideas between a player and the DM. So again, playing solo D&D, you get to make whatever call you want. And if you do it like I do, where you write it down, you may find that the little branch you went off on, you didn't like so much. So you just delete that work and you take the other side instead. Which, at a normal traditional D&D table, you're not going to be able to do that because there are so many moving parts to keep track of. Now, on the other side of the screen, as a player, it's hard not to get emotionally invested in your character. Yes, the DM is controlling all the monsters and the NPCs and the environment, but as a player, your contribution is always filtered through the lens of the player character that you're portraying. Yes, if your character dies in an adventure, you can just build another one. But at every table that I've been a player at, I've wanted to see the storytelling arc of my characters through. When you're running solo D&D though, you almost can't help but do the opposite. Because you're basically a DM and a player at the same time, if you're running a party of player characters, there's this weird ability to detach, which lets you experiment and try things you normally wouldn't feel comfortable with at a traditional table. So for me, a lot of times I end up doing powerful builds. You know, Sorlock, Sorkaden. If I go Ranger, I make sure to also pick up a little bit of Rogue to maximize my action economy, because I want to have the most amount of choices and the most impact as I can when, again, I am only allowed to contribute through the lens of my player character. And we could have a whole conversation about the role of min-maxing and stuff, but I mean, it is kind of lame if you're sitting next to one player and they get to use their action bonus action movement, and then the player next to you is quickening a spell and then doing Eldritch Blast, and then also being able to use the fly speed because they're some kind of Aarakocra Sorkaden. And then it gets to your turn and you're like, I attack, and I miss. Alright, on to the next person's turn. Your build almost determines how much time you get to play, and it is kind of lame to have a build where you're just kind of sitting there doing one little thing, and then it feels like everybody around you has a more fulfilling action economy. But when you're the writer for 4 player characters, it is so much more comfortable to be like, they don't need a bonus action, they just attack. And then you get to describe the action however you'd like. So it also allows you to experiment with a lot of different builds, and as a DM, you really get to see not only how different classes operate, but how they might operate together. One thing I've heard different DMs lament about over the years is the fact that they really have a hard time getting first-hand experience with all of the classes that D&D has to offer, because usually they're the DM. And the few times that they get to be a player, they end up gap filling, which means that really oftentimes they're going to be a support character because nobody ever wants to do that. But let's say you play solo D&D and you have a traditional party of 4 characters. You now get to experience 4 classes at the same time. And that's what I mean by it makes you a more well-rounded DM. You get a lot more first-hand experience with a lot of different classes at a variety of levels as they move through the adventure. And one little last upside while I close out this piece, you don't have to worry about scheduling. In my latest solo D&D game I played, Princes of the Apocalypse, which I did over my little Christmas break, there was one time I had to stop in the middle of combat. But then, because it was all written and documented, I could just pick it up when I was available again. You don't have to coordinate schedules with other people or whatever. You can play as little or as much as you'd like in a given sitting. Take that, scheduling. Alright, so far I've been spending this whole video advocating for solo D&D. So what are the downsides? Well, a lot of people play D&D because they like socializing with other humans. Can't do that with solo play. The other thing that cooperative D&D has going for it is the fact that you're getting other voices and ideas to bounce off of. Some of my favorite and most memorable D&D moments are when another person at the table had a much smarter or emotionally impactful idea than I did. And a lot of times because of that, we get some very powerful moments that emerge through organic dialogue. Remember, when I play solo D&D, I'm using the adventure modules kind of like a writing prompt. To play solo D&D where you're coming up and writing your own adventure and then running your own player characters through it, well, that really is writing a book. And writing a book is much harder than playing D&D. So I can see a lot of players struggling to play solo D&D more than with other friends at the table. For me, who's been DMing and playing for a long time, I'm deep enough into this hobby that I find the solo D&D experience extremely interesting, and it gives me the space to try out things, knowing that I'm not going to be wasting my own time or the time of other players. So ultimately, is solo D&D or traditional cooperative D&D a better option? Nah, I find I enjoy a healthy mix of both. Have you tried solo D&D before? Is this even a format you'd be interested in trying? Let me know in the comments down below. If you like this video, remember to let YouTube know, and have an awesome day, everybody. Bye-bye now.